In this video, I'm going to be talking about how I put together my photo portfolios with a specific focus on sequencing and curation. Over the last few months, I've been putting together some free ebook portfolios as a way to present my work. I like to have a little bit more control than I can on social media or even on my own website, so I've been putting together portfolios of anywhere from 20 to more than 100 photos into these free ebooks, and I get a lot of questions about them every time I put one out. Sometimes the focus is on how to actually create them, and that might be a separate video, the software and some of those decisions. But in this video, I'm going to answer some of the questions that I get about the sequencing and curation side of things. So before I get started, I wanted to share a few ideas that go into how I think about my own portfolios that will influence the discussion that I'm going to have today and will help explain some of the examples and why I chose the photos that I did. And I know that some people will want smaller portfolios or more tightly curated portfolios based on their style of work. So I just want to start this out by saying there's really no right or wrong. This is just how I choose to do, or how I choose to present my portfolios, and that I hope that some of these lessons might be helpful for some of you listening. So first of all, I focused almost entirely on smaller scenes. So that means things like intimate landscapes, abstracts, portraits of plants and trees, and other things that are the smaller details within the natural world. So I do photograph some grand landscapes, but generally I don't have what you would consider to be like the hero images, the type of photos that play really well as just the standalone photo. Instead, I like to put together a lot of smaller scenes to create an impression of a place, so that somebody walking away from viewing one of my portfolios gets a sense of maybe what the grand landscape looks like all the way down to some of those smallest details. And I hope that that process of including the full range of subjects out in the natural world actually encourages people to themselves look a little bit more closely and enjoy some of those little details a little bit more. So that's how I work, and that's what motivates me to photograph. So that's really reflected in my portfolio of work. I also like to present my photos in collections because I feel like together those photos work better. They amplify one another. They can expand on some ideas in a little bit more depth than I could with a few single photographs. So because I feel like my photos have more impact in collections, I like presenting my work in this style of presentation. So as I go through some of the examples, I'll hopefully be able to show how I feel like a collection of photos together actually amplifies the individual photos, and thus that factors into my curation and presentation decisions. And just generally, I'm going to have a lot more photos than a lot of nature photographers do. Like this portfolio of work from Acadia National Park represents maybe about a week in the field, and I think it includes maybe 70 to 80 photographs. And that just represents the fact that I work under all different types of light. I have a really broad range of interests in terms of subjects within nature, and I work again from the smallest details all the way up to the biggest grand landscapes. So because I'm working with a lot of different types of scenes out in nature, I just come back with a lot of photos. So my collections represent a lot of photographs compared to how some other photographers work. And again, there's no wrong or right. It's just how I do things with my own photography. So the examples that I'm going to show will reinforce all of these ideas. So with that, I'm going to jump into some specific examples so that you can see how some of these ideas actually play out with some of my photographs. And one thing that I do want to make sure that I mention, since I am going to be referencing this ebook a lot and some of the others that I've created in the past, I want to make sure that you know that you can get this ebook. You can download it through the link in the notes for this video below. So with that in mind, let's jump into some of the examples. One obvious place that a lot of photographers start for curating and presenting their portfolios is a collection by location or a collection by subject. And the idea behind this approach to presenting your work is that if all the photos are from the same place, they will naturally go together. Or if all the photos are of the same subject, that there will be some cohesiveness. And that's just sometimes not the case. So today I'm going to hopefully talk about some ideas that can take your curation process a little bit deeper for a little bit more cohesiveness and more tie-ins between the photos so that they together then take on even more than they do on their own. So all of these photos that you see here are from Acadia National Park. but I feel like they lack cohesiveness. So while they're from the same place, we have a total mishmash of colors, tonality, and subject matter. So there, from my perspective, the location isn't enough to tie this collection of photos together. So on the one hand, we have a black and white photo, which is fairly high contrast. And then we have a photo of some reeds, which is very, very bright, with only a little bit in terms of the darker tones. Then we have some photos that are more yellowish, greenish in their colors. And then we have some that are cooler. And then we have some that the autumn photos have a much warmer tone. So when we look at that collection together, even though they're from the same place, there are things that make it feel disjointed. And like the photos to me, don't really go together. Using that example as a place to start of like, how can we do things better? I like to think of this idea of better together. So it's a really simple idea that I use to guide how I curate my portfolios. And the simple lesson is that similar things generally look better together. And then that togetherness amplifies the ideas that you're working to communicate so that the collection has more impact compared to the individual photographs. This is an example of a collection. So again, all of these photos are from the same location, Acadia, but I curated this collection with a much greater emphasis on color and tone. So generally, all of the photos have some warmer colors, and those warmer colors create a tie-in that links them all together. They're generally darker overall, so if you were to look at the histogram of all of these photos, most of them would be in the middle to the left. So that communicates that the tonality of these photographs is darker overall. And while collections can absolutely work with mixed tonality, in this particular case, the darker tonality overall is another point that helps makes the collection feel a little bit more cohesive. So the colors are cohesive, the tonality is fairly cohesive, and the subjects, I think, work well together. So there's a mix of compositions, but they generally have enough similarities where there are some tie-ins and lead-ins from photo to photo. This is another example that's a little bit more thematic. So whereas the previous example had some mix of things you could find in a forest, things you could find on the coast, so the subject matter was fairly diverse. In this particular example, these are all things that you would find in a forest. So that's a more of another theme that I was thinking about when I pulled these photographs together. So here, green, the color green is the theme. The things you find in the forest are a theme, so similar subject matter. The tonality is a little bit more mixed, where there are some lighter photos and there are some darker photos, but generally the theme of green and the subject matter are the things that tie these photos together. So let's look at that first collection again. And now that you've seen two collections that to me feel a lot more cohesive, maybe you can see this collection as looking significantly less cohesive. I think it's helpful to revisit this original set after seeing those two other curated collections, because I feel like it makes the issues with the curation even more glaring this time. These photos just really have nothing to tie them together except for the location, and the location just isn't enough. These are all of the photos that I processed from my time in Acadia. And now the question is, how do I turn this into a portfolio? How do I turn this into a curated collection of photos that makes more visual sense than what you see here on the screen, where again, we have a mix of subjects, mix of tonality, mix of colors, and this is the chronological order that I took the photos, and you can see that really doesn't elevate this collection in any way. So we need to take these photos and then curate them and sequence them in a way that helps elevate the collection so that it's stronger together. And I generally think in terms of organization that I start with subject. So natural subjects that are found in the same ecosystem or the same subject across ecosystems. And I'll give some examples of what I mean by that. And then I also think in terms of themes. So similar composition or compositions that are complementary, colors that work well together, or photos that have some sort of similar mood. Organization is the first step that I start with. And here I use Lightroom to experiment with different themes. So I'll start with things like just organizing photos into possible collections around specific subjects. So things that I think, subjects that work well together. So that could be details from coastal locations or details from the forest or tree portraits, plant portraits. Those could all be places where I might start. Or I might be thinking more in terms of compositions. So all patterns, all repetition, all abstracts, and collating those into initial collections. I might also be thinking again in terms of colors. So do I see a lot of blue photos? Do I see a lot of warmer toned photos? I might start pulling some of those ideas together. Or did I experience a particular type of atmospherics or mood, and that by bringing those photos together, I might have the bones of a collection. So one example around mood might be if you had some particularly dynamic weather or you had fog on a couple of different days, that pulling together all of those lighter, brighter, misty, foggy photos into a collection might be a place to start. As I started working on organizing this collection of work, I started with things like subject. So here you see coastal details, where it's little small scenes, little details that I noticed while traveling and hiking in a coastal area. So that might be one of my first initial collections to see how those types of subjects work together. Another example might be by composition. So in this particular case, these are all small scenes where the composition relies on repetitive elements. So we have a lot of repeating mosses or repeating leaves with droplets on them. The pine boughs are repeating in the same way, facing in the same orientation. The grasses, obviously lots of repeating lines with little leaves. The lichen feels like the same, like you're just seeing a lot of the same patterns and same shapes in that lichen repeated across the frame. And then finally with the pine needles on dark water. So every composition that you see here is all about repetitive elements. So if we take those individual photographs and put them together, that repetitive element in terms of the composition can help create that tie-in from photo to photo. I might also start organizing by color or tone. So here we have generally cooler colors and generally some darker tones. So putting photos that fit those criteria into a collection in Lightroom and then seeing how they work together. And then finally, organizing by mood. So if in this example, these are all kind of quiet autumn photos, the light was soft and even, and there's a fairly consistent color palette. So here, if we had, let's say, a backlit aspen scene that felt very vibrant, bright light, very colorful, that might not fit quite as well in this particular collection because the theme here is quiet autumn. So that soft, even light is one of the things that ties these photographs together. So once I have some of these ideas in mind and I've started organizing some collections, seeing how things come together, then I'm going to get to the point of having to start making some decisions. So when I think about making decisions about what to include, what to not include in specific collections or in a sequence of photos, here are some of the things that I think about. And I think about it as a teeter-totter. So there's no right decision. There's no right answer. It's going to totally depend on the collection of photos you're working with. That you might have a great photo and it just doesn't fit in that particular body of work. And I'll show a couple of examples of how I made that decision for this particular collection. So where things fall is totally going to depend on each separate body of work that you're working with. So sometimes the reasons that I decide that a photo isn't going to make the cut is that it just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the themes that I've decided on. The color doesn't match. The composition seems to be an outlier. The photo just might objectively not be good enough. Like I have some emotional attachment to it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it should be in this collection. And usually I leave those photos in until the very end, and then maybe as part of the full body of work, it actually elevates that photo enough to leave it in. Other times it's just like, I liked looking at it as part of this collection, but it actually doesn't work. And then another thing that I often find is that there's just too much similarity in terms of concept. So if something's too similar, there's not a reason to include both, then that's another reason to exclude that particular photo from the collection. The things on the other side of the teeter-totter, I want to have cohesive yet mixed collections. I want some hills and valleys. I want some really good photos, and I want some photos that give a little bit of a breather. So I don't want my photo collections to be just greatest hits. So with that in mind, that mixed collection means that I want some hills where I feel really proud of these photos. I feel like they're strong, they stand alone. And then there are some valleys where maybe this collection of 4 photos together works really nicely. They might not independently be quite good enough, but they give a little bit of a breather as the viewer is looking through a body of work. Sometimes I do keep duplicates, and it's especially when it emphasizes an idea or provides a slightly different view on the same subject in a way that I think visually progresses the collection forward. So I think duplication is okay. Not too much, but a little bit. And then I'm trying to be more accepting of imperfections. So there are some photos in this particular collection that I might have dismissed before. Like I had some very windy conditions, so higher noise than I might like, and I've actually included a few photos that I would consider to have technical flaws. And I think that's okay because I'm trying to be more accepting of imperfections and chaos and include more of that in my work. So with these decision-making ideas in mind, I'm going to show you how I actually applied them through a few examples. So first, I was teaching at a conference during our trip, and some people wanted to experiment with intentional camera movement. So even though this isn't something I normally do, I was going along and having a lot of fun with everybody else. And I actually ended up with a photo that I kind of liked. I liked the feeling of that glowing background. You can see just little hints of lichen, like the colorful pops on the tree trunks. So I like this photo, and I feel like if I had more intentional camera movement photos, this would fit in my portfolio. But it's one photo out of 80 some photos. I don't think it makes sense to include this because it visually feels so different. It has that blurry quality, that abstract quality, and it just doesn't fit. So this would be an example of, on the teeter-totter, of this one would be out. This is another photo that I really liked from this trip, this pink reflection, or kind of pink, peach, purple reflection. And in this particular case, the reason that I decided not to include this comes back to color. If you look at the full ebook, you'll see that there are very, very few other photos that have these colors in it. And even though I tried a few different sequences, it just wasn't working. So while I think I'll still include this photo in my portfolio, my overall portfolio on my website, it doesn't belong in this particular collection. These 4 black and white photos were a little hard for me to get rid of. I, again, had them slotted in one of the collections. I felt like I had a collection of blue water abstracts, and I felt like it led fairly well into these black and white photos. But in the end, I decided that they just didn't fit. If I had 10 or 15 and had a section that was black and white entirely on its own, it might work. But in this particular case, having 4 photos that are black and white, fairly high contrast, in a fairly subtle ebook where subtlety is a pretty consistent theme, it just, again, didn't make sense to include these. So these are another example of photos that I like. I like all 4 of these, but they just don't make sense to include in this specific body of work. They will end up on my website, but they aren't in this ebook. So this is an example of a photo that just isn't good enough. And no matter how much I want it to be good enough, it's just not going to be. One of the things that I love about coastal locations is looking in tide pools, seeing all the life that exists in them, and just the fascinating world of like how creatures can live with waves coming in, waves going out, drying out, being underwater. It's just fascinating. So in this particular case, this was a tide pool with a bunch of little periwinkles and some other sea life. And I liked the mix of the periwinkle shells and the colors, but it's underwater, so there's some glare. That means the contrast is weird. It's really hard to tell what's going on. So even though I know what's going on, I feel like a viewer is going to be like, this just kind of looks like a mess. So I love these little periwinkles, but this photo just didn't make sense to include. So here's where we're more on the middle of that fulcrum on the teeter-totter of, I think these work, but they probably don't. They don't all work for sure. So how do you make the decision between 3 photos that are fairly similar? So the first 2 photos here are clearly of the same tree. So the fog situation is a little bit thicker on the left photo than it is in the middle photo. I like both of them. I think they work equally well in terms of the composition. The vertical might be a little bit stronger overall, I think, with the composition. But in terms of the layout of the ebook, it didn't work. So in this particular situation, I chose the photo on the left for the ebook because it worked with the layout. This photo will go in the ebook and my portfolio. And then I'll include the middle photo in my location gallery on my website. And then the third photo on the right, maybe my location gallery, maybe not. I feel like the sky and that one, too blank. It's just not quite working. So even though I like the fall colors and I like the misty scene, the mist to me doesn't work quite as well as the first 2. So these are all similar. These are too duplicative to include all 3 of them. So I chose the one that made the most sense for the layout. And then I might use the other 2 in a different context. These photos are examples of some duplication that I did include in this ebook portfolio. And in the first set on the left, the big 2, the aspen leaves carpeted on the ground. In this particular case, I liked the idea of showing the wider scene and then showing details. So even though these are the exact same leaves, I took them minutes apart, I do feel like including both, because it's a slightly different perspective, is helpful. You can tell on the lower photo, the more close-up, you can tell that those leaves are serrated. The edges are a little bit serrated, whereas you can't tell that as much from that wider view. So I think that these communicate ideas that are different enough and they amplify one another that including them as a sequence in this portfolio works. In terms of the seaweed on the right, it's the same idea, where it's the wider view, and then the second photo shows a little bit more detail so that a viewer can maybe appreciate a little bit more nuance, a little bit more in terms of the texture and the color. So both of these, they're duplicative ideas. They're the same subject, again, taken at a very similar time, but I feel like they both expand on the idea of the first photo. So that's an example of where I feel like duplication is okay. I wouldn't want very many of these in a portfolio, maybe 3 or 4 for a portfolio the size of what I'm working with here. But generally, I feel like including some of these in a portfolio of smaller scenes where your goal is to communicate about nuance and detail, that showing these examples of nuance and detail can be helpful. This photo of sand patterns is very similar. So in terms of my thinking about whether or not to include them. So I ended up including both of these in this same portfolio. And I included the photo on the left for design reasons because I had a nice mirror, a nice photo that I felt mirrored it well, that it made a nice pairing for a particular page layout. So that's the reason I included the photo on the left. But then the photo on the right, I felt like it was stronger. So even though it's duplicative, I separated them enough where they aren't going to be immediately after one another in a sequence, and hopefully will feel far enough apart that they don't feel terribly duplicative. So in this particular case, I normally wouldn't have included both of these because I do feel like they're too similar. But once I include the design reasons and the sequencing, trying to separate them a little bit, I feel like that's enough justification for me to include them both. So now that I've organized the photos into collections that are around ideas like subject, composition, color, some other theme, and I've worked through some of the issues around should this be in, should this be out, is it too duplicative, does it expand on an idea, and I generally have the set of photos that I want to work with. Now my job is to actually create the portfolio. And I feel like this is all about taking all of my ideas and experimentation from the organizing step and actually creating a sequence of photos, whether you're displaying it for a portfolio ebook or a book like what I'm talking about now, your website, or even a series of photos on Instagram, these same ideas can be helpful of thinking through how you want the viewer to experience a set of photographs. Now I'm going to talk about 2 examples of actually creating portfolios, and they're very different. So they're both these free portfolio ebooks that I've been creating, but I took a very different approach to both of them. So the first one is going to be this Acadia National Park body of work that I've been talking about, and then the second one will be a portfolio of work from Death Valley National Park. And again, both of these are free so that you can reference them if you would like to add onto your learning from this session. For this Acadia portfolio, this is how I think about the flow that the viewer experiences. So it starts with an introductory essay, which is about my ideas of the expansive mindset. So going into a trip with an open mind, not having a lot of expectations, being open to connecting with the landscape and some of those ideas, because I think that mindset was fundamental to my experience in the park. So I talked a little bit about those ideas in the introductory essay. And then I have 5 portfolios that create the ebook. And then I have short essays interspersed. So just a few, maybe 200 words. So those essays are much, much shorter. So the first grouping of photos is what I consider an autumn mix. So there are some autumn themes, but it's also other types of forest photos and subjects that I think work together through a green and kind of cooler toned autumn set of photographs. And then I move to a short essay. And then the next set of photos, I think, is a strong set, but it's probably not as strong as that initial autumn mix set. So that coastal scenes, and this is going to be seaweed, other sea life, sand patterns, one grand landscape. So all coastal scenes, generally on the cooler tones, and some cooler tones and some warmer tones. So sequencing with that color and tonality in mind. And then moving to another short essay, so another little bit of a breather. And then moving into bolder autumn. So these are going to be the very, very warm toned autumn photographs. And I think that collection probably appeals a little bit more to viewers. So that's a little bit of a high. And then back down to a short essay for a little bit of a break. And then a collection of photos that I really like and felt deserved to be included is some scenes of the park's lichen. Immediately, my first steps out of the car, seeing all the lichen growing on the trees was one of the first things that caught my eye. And I knew I wanted to photograph a lot of the lichen in the park. But I know that that's not going to be quite as interesting. So I wanted to put that collection a little later in the ebook, move to another short essay, and then move up to some water scenes. The collection is a lot of water reflections, water abstracts, reeds growing out of water, lily pads, those sorts of subjects. And some of my favorite photos from the collection are in that little body of work. So end on a high note and then the end of the ebook. So thinking about some highs and lows along the way to moderate that viewing experience, and then very carefully curating and sequencing each of those 5 portfolios. Here you can see the entire ebook layout, and you can get a sense of how the colors flow. So we can see the greens flowing together, and then the coastal photos are going to have some blue tones and some warmer tones, but thinking carefully about how the photos lead into one another so that all of those colors work well together. And then we have the bright colors of autumn, and then we move to all the photos of the lichen, and then end on the water-related abstracts and small scenes. And there I start with warm, move to bright, and end with cool. So again, thinking really deliberately about how that sequencing works for the overall ebook and then each individual collection. I'll contrast the approach that I took with this Acadia ebook with my Death Valley portfolio from my 2022 time in the park. So this ebook was more like a website gallery, since I only included one essay at the beginning and then the photos flowed without interruption. And one of the reasons that I felt like this approach worked a little bit better for this Death Valley portfolio is that the photos were generally more cohesive. So if we think about the Death Valley landscape, yes, there's a change in terms of elevation. So you're going to have different ecosystems at different elevations. But a place like Acadia, you're going to have a lot of ponds and lakes. You're going to have coastline. You're going to have mountainous regions, lots of forests. All of those things I think are visually, there's more incongruity with those ecosystems. Whereas Death Valley, the color palette is very similar. The rocks are pretty similar. The light falls upon the landscape in a similar way. So generally, that body of work without a lot of interludes, to me, felt pretty cohesive. So in this particular case with the Death Valley portfolio, I had a much different viewing flow. So I started with a long introductory essay that had a little bit of snark to it that was related directly to the portfolio. So that led the essay led directly into photos that were intended to make my point. And those started with some softer colors. And then I moved into a few photos with some greens, so some Joshua trees, and some other photos that had some greens in them. There weren't that many, so I included them as kind of maybe a little bit of a dip in that portfolio. And then went into an expansive section of cooler colors, so lots of pinks, lots of blues, and then ended the ebook with warmer colors and bolder scenes. So again, feeling like as a viewer is getting to the end, they're going to be seeing some more dramatic photos that might re-engage them if they kind of lost steam during the cool colors section. So those are my favorite photos, that cool colors section, but generally a viewer might like some of the photos at the end a little bit more. So including those at the end might keep someone a little bit more engaged. So if we step back and look at the flow, so the intention of this is not to be thinking about the individual photos, it's to see the flow of the colors through this ebook. And you can see very intentional sequencing where I'm starting out with lighter tonality, moving into some mix of blues and golds, then that little section of green, and then this expansive section of photos that are pinks, blues, peaches, so very soft, cool colors. And then at the end, I'm moving much more into dramatic, darker, more dynamic, warmer light. So that flow, you can see that flow even just in these little thumbnails. And again, if you'd like to actually see the photographs and see the sequencing for yourself, you can find a link to download this in the notes for this video. I'm going to leave with a few final examples of sequencing. So sequencing is, I think, where your idea of a portfolio, you have the concept, you have the photos, but then actually how do you order them in a way that helps them build upon one another and makes that visual flow feel cohesive. So with sequencing, I go back to the basic question of what ideas tie the photos into a sequence with the types of transitions that you want. So different people, different photographers with different bodies of work are going to want totally different types of transitions. So some people might want jarring, like where you're moving from one photo to another and you're feeling some kind of strong emotional reaction. My goal is pretty much the opposite of that. I want smooth, visually relaxed transitions. So my sequencing reflects that. My photography, I like calm, I like serene, graceful, soft colors. So I want my transitions to amplify that idea. So even though there's no right answer, I do think it's really helpful to think about what your intentions are for your portfolio and how you want the viewer to experience your work as you think about your sequencing decisions. So here, I'm going to go back to an idea that I shared at the very beginning of our talk today. And that's the idea. If photos are from one location, that means they go together, right? No. And I think this example shows why. So here we're talking about sequencing. We're not just talking about the collection of photos. So here we have 6 photos. We're actually talking about the order in which we present them to a viewer. So in this example, again, these photos were all taken in the same season in the same location. But I'm going to walk through how this sequence feels to me so that you can see some of the things that I'm thinking about and some of the reasons why I think this doesn't work terribly well. So our first photo here, we have vibrant, strong contrast due to the backlighting, and then we have strong lines. So the composition has some pretty dominant features with those strong lines and the white chunks. So then we add a photo of a low-growing juniper, and the compositions are dramatically different, and the colors have very few tie-ins. There's a little bit of green in the first photo, but it's not dominant enough to serve as a tie-in. So I don't see these two photos as having much in terms of visual tie-ins with one another. And then we add this third photo, And I feel like 2 and 3 work together, that the greens tie in. I think the compositions are complementary. They were both created under soft light. So 2 and 3, that sequence works. But when you go from 1 to 2 to 3, 1 feels like an outlier because of the strong colors and the strong lighting. If we add in this 4th photo, I feel like the 4th one feels very out of place. The cooler reds and pinks work really nicely with the juniper photo, so photo number 2. But the closest photo in terms of proximity in this, how we're viewing this sequence, is the photo directly above it. And these photos clash dramatically in terms of color and light. So if I'm putting a sequence together of autumn photos, I want to keep photos like the 1st photo and the 4th photo as far apart from one another as possible, and have things that are stronger tie-ins and lead-ins than these two, because they don't work very well together. If we consider them as a sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4, I don't think 3 leads into 4 very well either. So the compositions are similar and the lighting is similar, but the colors to me don't go nicely together. Now we add in 5th photo, and I feel like it really clashes with photo number 4. So that those pinkish reddish leaves just do not go with the rest of this collection. So photos 2, 3, and 5 could work together, I think, as a collection, but not how they're presented here. I just feel like the compositions, the colors, and the light of this collection, they all really visually clash. And then we add in another photo that's a small scene that is colorful. So it's colorful like the rest of the photos, but I don't think it coordinates very well with the color palette. And I don't think the composition works very well together. The little juniper represented in photo number 2 kind of goes with photo number 6, but when you put them in the rest of this collection, I just don't think this set works. There aren't lead-ins. There's not cohesiveness in terms of the colors. Some of the lighting is different enough where I feel like they clash. And then I don't think the compositions necessarily complement each other well. So for all of these reasons, I don't think that this is a very good curation in terms of the overall portfolio. So these 6 photos don't work very well together, and the order that they're presented in, to me, doesn't work well at all. In this example, I'm going to walk through 6 photos that are the opening sequence of the ebook portfolio. And the reason that I chose these 6 to work through is because photos number 4 and 5 here, I think generally don't go very well with the rest of this entire photographic collection. So I needed to create a sequence that would work so that I could include them. And that essentially meant that I wanted to isolate them from a lot of the warmer colors, the warmer autumn colors in the rest of the ebook. And that meant finding some other ways to tie them into a collection. And I felt like the green theme and this particular set of compositions was one of the ways that I could tie them together. So what ideas from one photo lead visually into the next, so that once you're done looking at that series of 6 photos, that it feels like a cohesive viewing experience, and that the photos amplify one another as you move through that sequence. So the first photo that I'm going to start this sequence with is these pine boughs with hints of yellow. And even though this is a really simple photo, it was one of my favorites from the trip. I really like the pattern and the composition. And I felt like the fact that this composition relies on that repetition and the pattern, that I could use those ideas to lead into the next photo. So the next photo also has hints of that yellowish green in the center of the little moss plants. So that visual, that tie-in between the colors helps create a little bit of flow from these one photo to the next. And then the composition of both photos, they rely on some of the similar ideas, but they're different enough that they provide some visual variation so they don't feel too samey, like you're looking at just like this, a slight variation on the same idea. There's enough visual difference, like shallow depth of field, a little bit more contrast, but those similarities are enough to tie them together. So going back to that teeter-totter idea we were talking about, you don't want things to be too similar necessarily. In some cases, very similar can work. But for this body of work, I wanted there to be some similarities that create tie-ins, but not too much repetition. So moss leads to more mosses. But here we have enough visual variation that I think it works. So there is that duplication in terms of subject and composition, but this one is brighter, it's more dense, and that I think those things together, again, leave enough visual variation to make it interesting in terms of the sequence of the photos. So the brightness and the soft greens then will prepare for leading into the fourth photo. So here's the fourth photo, and this is the one that I really wanted to include in this portfolio, but just couldn't figure out how because these colors are very pastel. They're pastel pinks, there's some light yellows, some kind of soft blue tones, and this didn't fit in well with the other autumn photos from this collection. So by grouping them with the greens and the yellows, I was able to isolate them from those other autumn photos where they didn't necessarily look very good together. So here, the three previous photos have enough similarities in terms of color and light to lead nicely into the photo of the tree that is all about the soft pastel leaves. And then this photo number 4, that composition also relies on repetition. So it's a different kind of repetition, but it's enough that provides that through line in terms of the sequence. And then the colors continue in this photo of the cinquefoil plants. And so although this photo is darker in terms of the colors and the contrast, the colors match closely enough that I think that it feels cohesive. So the colors are more the lead-in between these two photos. And then we go back to the juniper that I had in the previous sequence. And although it's hard to see at this size, the juniper does have blue berries, and those blue berries help provide a connection to some of the blue shadows and the blue rock in the 5th photo. So those are just little tiny things that are those visual cues that provide just slight tie-ins. So here we have greens, lots of greens that are all very complementary greens. So we don't have greens that are too yellowish or too bluish, but it's kind of somewhere in the middle. So all these greens look nice together. They were all photographed under soft light, so we have generally a similar level of contrast. We don't have like bright backlighting or like a light bright feel, so the complementary or the light is similar enough that I think it works across the set of 6. And then the complementary compositions pull this together, so these cooler autumn colors can fit in this collection of 6 photos pretty well, whereas they wouldn't fit very well in a collection of warmer toned yellowish, orangish autumn photos. So this collection, I think it works together as these 6, but then when you think about photo 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as a sequence, that thinking about how photos lead through that sequence and how the viewer is going to experience them is one of those really important things about thinking through the curation process. So here we can go back to this collection, so the first one that I shared, and now I hope that you can see how much stronger the other collection looks in terms of cohesiveness. So here's one more look at this collection, and I think when you compare the two, this one feels substantially stronger. The photos lead into one another in a way that makes a lot more sense, and to me it feels much more visually cohesive. Thanks so much for joining me for this video. I hope that some of these ideas will be helpful as you put together your next portfolio of work, especially in terms of thinking about how you sequence your photos and how you do your overall curation and presentation. If you have any questions about any of the topics that I covered today, please feel free to ask below in the comments, and I'll be sure to get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks so much.